The wind howled through the small village like a restless spirit, carrying with it the sharp scent of winter and the faint tang of smoke from distant hearths. In a narrow, crumbling hut on the edge of the settlement, a young woman knelt on a threadbare mat, her body racked with pain and exhaustion. Every breath was a battle, every contraction a test of endurance that seemed to stretch endlessly into the cold night. She clutched the coarse blanket around her shoulders, seeking comfort that was only found in fleeting moments of warmth. Her face was pale, etched with lines of fatigue. Yet her eyes burned with a determination that refused to yield to despair. She had been alone for most of her pregnancy, abandoned by those who should have protected her. Her family, unable or unwilling to provide support, had left her to fend for herself, leaving her to navigate the perilous final hours of her pregnancy with nothing but the faint hope that somehow she would survive, and so would the child she carried. The village, though small and seemingly close-knit, offered no shelter for her plight. Neighbors peeked curiously through their doors but quickly averted their eyes, unwilling to intervene or offer help. As if acknowledging her suffering might invite it into their own lives, the labor was grueling. Every wave of pain stole her breath and threatened to buckle her strength. Her body trembled, sweat matting her hair to her forehead, yet she pushed onward. She murmured to her unborn child, whispering promises she hoped to keep, promises of love, protection, and safety. "Hold on, little one," she whispered through clenched teeth. "I'll bring you into this world, and I swear I'll keep you safe." Her words were more than just prayers. They were a lifeline, a fragile thread connecting her hope to the life she was about to bring forth. As the hours dragged on, the reality of her isolation became painfully clear. There was no midwife, no familiar hands to guide her, no soothing voice to calm her racing heart. The hut offered only shadows and cold, the floor hard and unyielding beneath her knees. Every sense was heightened, the chill biting at her skin, the dim light of a flickering candle casting long, trembling shadows on the walls, the faint rustle of rats in the corner, and the distant moans of the wind outside. In this bleak and unforgiving environment, her courage became her only ally. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the first cries of a newborn pierced the air. The sound was fragile but insistent, a tiny declaration of existence in a world that had offered little kindness. Relief and elation surged through her, mingling with the exhaustion that threatened to collapse her entirely. She held her child close, marveling at the small, perfect features, the soft skin, the helpless but precious life in her arms. In that moment, there was a flicker of triumph, a sense that she had achieved something miraculous. Even amid despair. Yet, the triumph was bitterly tinged with fear. She knew that in this harsh world, survival did not come easily, and the tiny bundle she cradled was entirely vulnerable. She whispered lullabies she barely remembered, her own voice trembling as she tried to instill a sense of safety even when none existed. Outside, the wind continued its restless journey, and the village remained indifferent. Inside, a mother and her newborn clung to each other, a fragile island of warmth and hope in the midst of hardship. This was the beginning of a story defined by resilience, courage, and the fragile glimmer of hope that can persist even in the darkest of circumstances. In these first moments, the young woman's strength and determination set the stage for everything that would follow. As life, both hers and her child's, balanced precariously on the edge of a harsh and uncertain world, the fragile joy of childbirth barely had time to settle in her heart when the harsh reality of her world came crashing down. She barely had the strength to cradle her newborn before footsteps echoed outside the hut, firm, purposeful, and devoid of compassion. Her heart sank as the door creaked open, revealing the cold, calculating faces of the men sent to claim her. They were strangers, agents of a distant master who cared nothing for the life she had just brought into the world. Their presence turned the small sanctuary she had created with her labor into a place of fear and helplessness. Her pleas went unheard. "Please, give me time," she begged, her voice hoarse and trembling. "My child, we need." But the men ignored her, their eyes empty of pity, focused only on the transaction they had come to carry out. The reality of her position struck her like a cruel blow. She had no power, no recourse. She was property now, a commodity in a world that saw human life as a mere currency for wealth and status. The bitter irony that she had just given life only to be treated as less than nothing was almost too much to bear. Her newborn whimpered in her arms, a tiny voice of innocence and need, and she pressed the baby close, trying to shield it from the cold eyes that regarded her so coldly. She tried to reason, to bargain, but every word fell on deaf ears. The men were efficient, practiced in their cruelty, and unmoved by the anguish of a mother. They spoke in clipped tones, discussing the price, the arrangements, and the inevitable separation. With every syllable, the weight of the world seemed to crush her spirit. She realized with a sharp pang of despair that no one would intervene, no friend, no family, no sympathetic stranger. She was utterly alone. The moment of separation was swift and brutal. They wrenched the child from her arms, ignoring her cries, the protest tearing through her like jagged shards. She reached out, fingers brushing the soft skin of her newborn, desperate to keep the connection alive, but it was futile. The child was taken from her grasp, leaving a hollow ache in her chest that felt as though it could never be filled. Her tears fell freely, unrestrained, her sobs echoing in the small hut, a mournful symphony of loss. Yet, even in the midst of despair, a spark of defiance remained. She refused to collapse entirely, refusing to let the men see her broken completely. Her mind raced, searching for a plan, any way to reclaim some semblance of control. She knew that in this cruel exchange she had little to leverage, but the thought of survival, of continuing to exist despite the injustice, ignited a stubborn determination. She would endure. She must endure for herself, for the child she could not hold, and for the hope that life might still offer a second chance. The men completed their transaction with mechanical precision, speaking only of sums and signatures. The paper exchanged hands, the price was settled, and her fate was sealed. She was no longer just a woman. She was a possession, a tool to be used by someone who saw her existence only in terms of value. The world felt colder, darker, and infinitely more merciless than it had just hours before. Yet in the shadows of her despair, a faint glimmer of resilience began to flicker. As the men left, she was left alone in the quiet of the hut, the baby gone, her body exhausted, and her spirit battered. The journey from the village to her new home was a blur of cold wind, rattling wheels, and the relentless grip of fear. She rode in silence, her hands bound and her heart heavy. The memory of her newborn's cries etched painfully into her mind. Every bump in the road sent shivers of discomfort through her aching body, but it was the emotional weight, the knowledge that she had no choice in her own life, that made the trip unbearable. Her mind wrestled with despair and disbelief. How could a world that allowed her to give life also treat her as a commodity, a thing to be traded? When the carriage finally stopped, she was ushered into the grand estate of her new owner. The opulence was overwhelming, a stark contrast to the poverty she had known. Marble floors gleamed under the flickering light of chandeliers, walls were lined with fine tapestries, and the air was heavy with the scent of polished wood and exotic flowers. Yet, instead of comfort, the surroundings only deepened her sense of alienation. Every step she took seemed to echo in the vast, empty halls. A reminder that she had entered a world where her identity was irrelevant and her freedom non-existent. She was introduced to the household staff, a collection of stern-faced individuals who regarded her with a mixture of suspicion and indifference. The head housekeeper, a tall woman with sharp eyes, gave her instructions in clipped, exacting tones. The tasks assigned were demanding: cleaning, cooking, running errands, and attending to the needs of the estate's occupants. The young woman felt the sting of humiliation and the weight of expectation pressing down upon her. Every movement, every mistake would be scrutinized, and the slightest lapse could invite punishment. Yet even in this environment of cold efficiency, she found herself observing, learning, and adapting. She had survived hardship before. She could endure this as well. She quickly noticed the patterns of the household, the servants' routines, the temperaments of the family she served, the unspoken rules that governed behavior. Knowledge became a shield. With quiet determination, she began to perform her duties with precision, striving to avoid drawing negative attention, while preserving the small fragments of dignity she could claim for herself. Her days blurred into a rhythm of work and exhaustion. She awoke before dawn to light the fires and prepare the household, moved from one task to the next with barely a moment to rest, and collapsed into a narrow bed at night, her body aching and her mind heavy with memories of the child she could not hold. The isolation was suffocating. Despite the bustle of the estate, she felt utterly alone. Conversations with the staff were curt, functional, and devoid of warmth. Friendship, or even kindness, seemed a luxury she could not afford. Still, small sparks of hope flickered in the corners of her life. She observed the kindness of a stable boy who offered a quiet smile, the gentle humor of a maid who hummed while working, and the occasional soft gaze from her distant owner. These fleeting gestures reminded her that humanity existed even in this cold, ordered world. Each small connection, each minor act of empathy, became a thread of comfort in the tapestry of her otherwise constrained life. In the evenings, when the household settled and the rooms grew quiet, she would sit by a window, staring at the dark gardens beyond. She would allow herself to dream, just for a moment, of freedom, of holding her child again, of a life where she could make her own choices. Though such thoughts were dangerous in a place where hope could be mistaken for rebellion, they became a vital sustenance, a secret power that nourished her spirit. By the end of her first week, she had begun to understand the true weight of her new reality. She was a possession, bound by contracts and expectations, yet within her, a quiet resolve grew stronger. She realized that survival in this world would not come from defiance alone, but from patience, resilience, and the careful observation of those around her. She had been sold, yes, but she had not been defeated. Each day she endured, each task she completed, and each small connection she forged became part of the foundation for the life she hoped to reclaim, not just for herself, but for the child who had been torn from her arms. In the sprawling halls of the estate, she had begun to settle into a cautious rhythm, completing her tasks with quiet efficiency, learning the ways of her new environment, and silently enduring the weight of her circumstances. It was during one of these routine days that she first noticed him, the man who had purchased her. Unlike the servants or the distant family members, he moved with an air of authority that was both commanding and elusive. His presence was not one of intimidation but of quiet observation, a subtle awareness that seemed to sweep over the room without uttering a word. He appeared at unexpected moments, often standing in the shadows of a doorway or leaning casually against a pillar, watching the household function with a measured, almost calculating gaze. There was something about the way he observed her that unsettled her, a feeling that her every movement was being silently judged, not for mistakes, but for character. His eyes were sharp, yet not cruel. They seemed to search for something deeper, something beyond the surface of who she appeared to be. She could not tell if this attention was dangerous or benign, and that uncertainty made her both wary and curious. The first direct interaction came unexpectedly. She was carrying a tray of tea through the long, echoing corridors when he called her name softly, almost as if testing the sound of it. Her heart leapt into her throat. She stopped, startled, and turned to face him. The man's expression was calm, unreadable, and in that moment she felt the full weight of her powerlessness. Yet there was no harshness in his voice, only a gentle, deliberate tone that invited attention without demanding it. "You have been here only a short while," he said. "And yet, I see how carefully you navigate this place." Her instinct was to shrink back, to offer the polite, obedient response she had been trained to give. But something in his demeanor disarmed her. There was no malice, no impatience, only a quiet curiosity, as though he were interested in her as a person rather than a possession. She responded cautiously, her voice small but steady, acknowledging his observation without overstepping. In that brief exchange, a subtle connection formed, delicate and fragile, yet tangible. Over the following days, he began to interact with her more deliberately, always observing, always attentive, but never imposing. He would ask about her tasks, her thoughts on the household, or even her small opinions on trivial matters. At first, these conversations were brief, almost ceremonial, but gradually, they began to reveal a side of him that was human and nuanced, someone who could see beyond the surface, someone who recognized resilience and strength when he saw it. What unsettled her most, however, was the sense that he already knew much about her life before she arrived. He had learned of her recent childbirth, the loss of her baby, and the cruelty that had brought her to his estate. And yet, there was no judgment, no reproach, only a quiet acknowledgment that her story had shaped the woman she had become. It was in his careful, measured attention that she began to understand something crucial, that he had not purchased her merely as a possession, but perhaps in some way as someone he believed could endure, adapt, and even thrive if given the chance. Even though she remained cautious, understandably wary of anyone who held her fate in their hands, there was a strange comfort in his presence. Unlike the other figures in the household, he seemed to notice the subtleties of her character, her quiet dignity. By now, the young woman had begun to understand the rhythms and expectations of the grand household she had been thrust into. The initial shock of her arrival had faded, replaced by a careful, almost instinctive navigation of her duties. She moved through the estate with quiet precision, dusting the ornate furniture, preparing meals, and attending to the needs of the staff and residents alike, but beneath this diligence was something far more subtle, a desire to bring warmth and humanity to a place that often felt cold and rigid. Despite her constrained position, she found small ways to make life a little easier for those around her. When a child of the household dropped a toy and could not reach it, she would quietly retrieve it, offering a gentle smile that spoke more than words ever could. When the kitchen staff struggled under heavy workloads, she would discreetly assist, smoothing the tasks without drawing attention to herself. These acts were modest, almost invisible, yet they had a ripple effect that began to soften the harsh edges of her environment. Her compassion extended beyond people. She noticed the horses in the stables, thin and weary from overwork, and would linger to brush their coats and speak soothingly to them. She cared for the animals quietly, without complaint, and in return, they began to respond to her presence with trust. Even the household dogs, initially wary of her, gradually approached her with tentative affection. In these small gestures, she found a semblance of control and purpose, a reminder that kindness could exist. Even in a world that had treated her so harshly. It was not only her acts of service that set her apart. It was the manner in which she carried herself. There was a quiet dignity in her movements, a steadiness that suggested resilience forged in adversity. The staff began to notice her calm amidst chaos. the way she remained composed when tensions flared or tasks became overwhelming. Slowly, respect began to replace indifference. Even those who had initially been dismissive of her presence started to seek her out for guidance or to confide in her. Drawn to the warmth she radiated despite her lowly position, her owner, the mysterious man who had purchased her, took note of these small acts as well. Though he rarely intruded upon her duties, he observed her quietly, recognizing something extraordinary in her behavior. She was not merely surviving, she was asserting a subtle form of influence, shaping the household in ways that went unnoticed yet were profoundly felt. Her compassion was not performative. It came from a genuine desire to alleviate suffering, to bring light to a world that had shown her very little. These gestures, though small, also became a source of solace for the young woman herself. Each smile she coaxed from a child, each nod of gratitude from a colleague, and each trusting glance from an animal reinforced the fragile sense of hope she clung to. In a world where she had been stripped of her most precious possession, her child, these moments of connection became a lifeline, a reminder that life could still contain beauty, even amid pain and injustice, and yet she remained cautious. She knew that kindness in this household could be misinterpreted as overstepping boundaries, and she was careful to balance her compassion with discretion. Her acts were subtle, often unnoticed by those in authority, but their impact was undeniable. Slowly, she began to carve out a place for herself, not as a servant defined solely by her labor, but as a presence capable of influencing the emotional fabric of the household. In these small, almost imperceptible ways, she began to assert her humanity in a world that had tried to deny it. Through her compassion, she became more than her circumstances, more than the cruel circumstances that had brought her here. Each act of kindness was a statement of resilience, a quiet but firm declaration that, though she had been sold, she had not lost her heart, her spirit, or her capacity to touch the lives of others. The young woman's life in the estate had settled into a rhythm, her days consumed by tasks and the careful navigation of the household's strict hierarchies. Yet, amid the routine, an unexpected connection began to emerge, one that neither she nor her mysterious owner could have anticipated. The man who had purchased her, once a distant and enigmatic figure, began to engage with her more directly, not out of obligation, but from genuine interest. These interactions were subtle at first, a passing question, a quiet observation, but over time, they became moments of tentative intimacy that neither could ignore. It began with small acknowledgments of her efforts. "You've tended the stables well," he remarked one morning as she finished brushing the horses, his voice carrying a tone that was neither condescending nor formal. She started, startled by the rare acknowledgment, and replied with a quiet, "Thank you, sir," bowing her head. He did not press further, but the simple recognition lingered with her, sparking a cautious curiosity about the man behind the reserved exterior. For her, who had known only betrayal and hardship, this quiet acknowledgment felt like a fragile lifeline, an indication that someone saw her not as a possession, but as a person. As days turned into weeks, the exchanges became more frequent and personal. He would ask her opinions about minor household matters or the care of the animals, and sometimes, when the house was quiet, he would inquire about her thoughts and feelings. At first, she answered with cautious restraint, aware of the delicate power balance between them. Yet his questions were never probing in a threatening way. Instead, they carried an implicit respect, a recognition of her intellect and sensitivity. Slowly, she began to trust these interactions, sensing that he truly wished to understand her. This trust did not develop overnight. She had been betrayed too many times, learned too painfully to place faith in others without caution. But he had a way of listening that was disarming. He observed the smallest details, remembered her preferences, and responded to her with a patience that was almost unheard of in her recent life. In this careful attentiveness, she felt a rare sense of validation. For the first time since her child had been taken from her, she experienced a connection that was not transactional, coercive, or rooted in power. The bond was further strengthened by shared silences and unspoken understanding. There were moments when they worked side by side, tending to tasks around the estate, and in the quiet of these shared spaces, a subtle rapport began to form. They did not always speak, yet there was a mutual acknowledgement of presence, an understanding that their lives, though vastly different in circumstance, intersected in ways that mattered. These moments built a foundation of trust that neither could easily define, yet both sensed as profoundly significant. He also began to show glimpses of vulnerability, though cautiously. Occasionally, his eyes betrayed a fleeting concern for her well-being, or a faint shadow of unease at the strict hierarchy she navigated daily. In response, she offered small gestures of reassurance, subtle smiles, or brief words of encouragement. It was a delicate dance, each step measured, each gesture significant, as they tested the boundaries of this newfound connection. Through these interactions, a bond, quiet, fragile, yet undeniable, was forming. It was a bond rooted not in obligation, wealth, or ownership, but in mutual recognition of strength, resilience, and humanity. For her, it was the first sense of emotional safety she had felt in months. For him, it was a discovery of admiration and respect for someone who had endured far more than most could imagine. By the end of this period, both realized that their relationship had subtly shifted. They had moved from mere observer and observed, buyer and bought, into something more complex, a connection defined by trust, subtle care, and an unspoken understanding that each saw the humanity in the other. Though neither dared name it yet, the foundation of something profound had been laid, a bond that would shape. The bond between the young woman and her enigmatic owner had grown quietly, delicately, over the weeks she had spent at the estate. Yet beneath the developing trust and mutual understanding lay shadows of the past that she had carefully kept hidden. Though she had formed a subtle connection with him, her history, the birth, the loss of her child, the betrayal and sale remained locked away, a painful secret she could not yet risk revealing. To speak of it would be to expose the rawest parts of herself. And in a world that had shown her little kindness, she was not yet ready. But secrets have a way of surfacing, particularly when someone notices the small, quiet ways grief lingers. He began to see the traces of her past in her expressions, the way her eyes would cloud with sorrow when she thought no one was watching, the fleeting moments when she seemed lost in memory. He observed her hands, calloused from labor and work, noting a certain fragility in her posture, a careful tension that suggested more than ordinary hardship. He saw her reaction when she passed a mother and child in the gardens, a subtle tightening of her jaw, a fleeting shadow over her usually steady gaze. Slowly, pieces of the story began to emerge, even without her words. Curiosity and concern prompted him to gently probe, always delicately, never demanding. One quiet afternoon, while she tended to the stables, he asked softly, "You have endured much, haven't you?" Her hands stilled mid-task, the brush hovering over the horse's coat. The question was simple, almost casual, but it carried a depth that made her heart race. She hesitated, weighing the risk of opening herself against the rare trust she had begun to feel. In the end, the words tumbled out not all at once, but in fragments. The labor, the solitude, the betrayal, the loss of her child. Each revelation was heavy, spoken in a voice trembling with both sorrow and courage. He listened quietly, his expression unreadable, but his mind and heart absorbed every detail. The cruelty of her circumstances, the injustice she had suffered, he felt a deep, almost painful empathy for her. Anger rose within him, not at her, but at the world that had treated her so unjustly, at the society that allowed human lives to be bargained and traded. He realized that the woman before him was not only resilient but extraordinary, having survived experiences that would have crushed most people entirely. This discovery shifted the dynamic between them. He no longer saw her merely as a talented or resilient servant, but as someone who had endured unimaginable hardship and retained her strength and dignity. There was a quiet admiration in his gaze, tempered by concern and something more tender, though he did not yet name it. He became even more attentive to her needs, offering small comforts and reassurances, seeking to ease her burdens without overstepping. Recognizing the delicate balance of trust they were nurturing, for her part, revealing her past was both terrifying and liberating. Speaking the truth of her suffering brought a weight off her chest, a recognition that someone understood, genuinely and empathetically, the depths of her loss. She felt a new dimension of safety in his presence, a realization that the bond they were forming could encompass not just shared moments, but shared pain. The vulnerabilities she had long hidden became a bridge, connecting her more fully to him, allowing trust to deepen into something more profound. In the aftermath, the atmosphere between them shifted subtly but irrevocably. The man who had once been distant and enigmatic now seemed invested, not merely in her labor or obedience, but in her well-being, her healing, and the restoration of her spirit. And for her, the first flickers of hope began to return, not just for survival, but for the possibility of life beyond suffering, life in which she might regain dignity, respect, and even joy. By the end of this revelation, both recognized that the past, while painful and inescapable, could also be the foundation for understanding and connection. Her history was no longer solely a mark of trauma. It was a testament to her resilience, and it had drawn them closer, forging a bond built not on ownership, but on empathy, trust, and the recognition of shared humanity. Weeks of quiet observation, shared glances, and subtle exchanges had culminated in a moment of decision. The man who had purchased her could no longer ignore the injustice of her circumstances or the extraordinary resilience she had demonstrated. Though the household regarded her as property, someone to be managed and controlled, he recognized something far greater in her: courage, compassion, and an unyielding spirit that deserved more than mere survival. Yet to act on this recognition meant taking a risk, a defiance of the rigid expectations of the society in which he lived, a challenge to the very system that had allowed her suffering in the first place. He spent nights pacing his study, reviewing the legal and social implications of what he planned. Releasing her from her obligations, granting her freedom within the estate, and offering her the chance to rebuild her life were not decisions to be taken lightly. There were contracts, expectations, and the potential disapproval of peers who would see any act of generosity toward someone like her as scandalous or imprudent. And yet, each thought of her, the quiet dignity with which she had endured hardship, the compassion she showed even in her own suffering, drove him forward. He understood that he could not, in good conscience, allow her to remain merely a servant, bound by circumstance and trauma, when he had the power to offer her something more. The first step was subtle. He began to provide her with small privileges that no other servant enjoyed: extra time to rest, access to books, and occasional small tokens of comfort, all gestures designed to signal that her value was not measured by labor alone. She noticed, of course, though she did not yet understand the full extent of his intention. These gestures fostered a tentative sense of security, a glimmer of hope that life could, perhaps, be different than she had believed. Then came the pivotal moment. One afternoon, he summoned her to the library, a room she had rarely entered. The shelves were lined with volumes of history, philosophy, and literature, and sunlight spilled across the polished wooden floors. There, in that quiet, sunlit space, he addressed her directly, his voice steady yet carrying the weight of earnest intent. He spoke of what he had seen in her, her strength, her resilience, her unwavering kindness despite the cruelty she had endured. He acknowledged the profound injustice she had suffered and told her that she would no longer be bound by the same restrictions, that she would have the opportunity to live a life of dignity within the estate, free from servitude. Her reaction was a mixture of disbelief, hesitation, and cautious hope. Freedom had been a concept she had long abandoned, something unimaginable after months of oppression and loss. She feared it might be a trick, a fleeting illusion designed to test her, and yet the sincerity in his gaze and the weight of his words conveyed truth. Tentatively, she began to imagine life differently, days not dominated solely by labor, evenings not spent in exhaustion, and perhaps one day, the possibility of rebuilding the pieces of herself that had been broken. The risk he took was not without cost. By offering her this chance, he positioned himself against societal norms and the expectations of those around him. Yet in that defiance, there was integrity, and a rare act of moral courage that mirrored the quiet heroism he had observed in her. In granting her this opportunity, he was not merely liberating her from servitude. He was affirming her humanity, her worth, and her right to hope. As she absorbed his words, a subtle transformation began to take root within her. She realized that this act was not merely generosity, it was a declaration of trust and belief in her. For the first time in months, perhaps years, she allowed herself to believe that she could forge a life on her own terms, that her past, though painful, did not define her future. And in that moment, the fragile beginnings of a new life began to bloom, nurtured by courage, trust, and the willingness of one man to take a risk on the extraordinary woman before him. With the risk taken and freedom offered, the young woman stepped tentatively into a new chapter of her life. For the first time since the cruel moments following childbirth, she felt a sense of possibility, not just survival, but the chance to rebuild, to reclaim parts of herself that had been shattered by loss and betrayal. At first, the freedom was almost overwhelming. Every decision, no matter how small, required thought and initiative. Should she tend the gardens, explore the library, or rest in the quiet of the unused sitting room? She realized that choice itself, once denied to her, was a powerful and liberating force. Her days became a careful balance of exploration, learning, and self-care. The estate, once a place of servitude and cold hierarchy, now offered opportunities she had never imagined. She spent hours in the library, absorbing knowledge, losing herself in stories and histories, and allowing her mind to expand beyond the narrow confines of labor. She discovered new skills, tried her hand at painting and stitching, and found satisfaction in accomplishments that were hers alone, unmeasured by anyone else's expectations. Each small success became a stepping stone toward the confidence she had thought lost forever. Socially, she began to form connections that nurtured her spirit. The staff, once merely colleagues in survival, became companions and allies. She shared laughter, stories, and quiet moments of companionship with those who respected her autonomy and appreciated her presence. In these bonds, she discovered something vital. Trust could exist even in a world that had once seemed cruel and indifferent. Each new relationship was a gentle affirmation that her life could hold warmth, friendship, and mutual respect. The man who had purchased her continued to play a complex role in her life. He remained observant and supportive, offering guidance and encouragement without imposing demands. His respect for her autonomy allowed her to grow without fear, and his quiet admiration bolstered her confidence. There were moments when their shared glances conveyed understanding without words, an acknowledgement of the journey they had traversed together from possession and powerlessness to recognition and choice. The trust between them deepened, and while unspoken emotions lingered, the foundation of safety and respect allowed her to heal without pressure. Healing, however, was not linear. Memories of her child, the betrayal, and the trauma she had endured still surfaced in quiet moments. She often found herself gazing at the gardens, imagining the child she could not hold, and feeling the ache of loss anew. Yet, unlike before, she did not allow these memories to crush her spirit. She acknowledged her pain, wept when necessary, and used her sorrow as a reminder of her resilience. The man who had once purchased her gave her space to process her grief without judgment. Understanding that true recovery required patience and compassion. As the days passed, her transformation became evident even to those around her. She walked with a renewed grace, spoke with quiet confidence, and approached challenges with measured courage. The household, once an arena of rigid control and hierarchy, now bore witness to her emergence as someone who was not defined by past suffering but by her strength, intelligence, and compassion. Most importantly, she began to envision a future. Though the loss of her child remained a wound she could not forget, she dared to dream of possibilities beyond grief, meaningful work, friendships built on respect, and even the tentative hope of love and family again. The trauma of her past had forged her spirit, but it no longer dictated her life. Instead, she was creating a narrative of resilience, hope, and renewal, embracing the freedom that had been granted to her with courage and determination. By the end of this period, she had become a symbol of quiet strength, a testament to the human capacity for recovery and reinvention. She was no longer merely a survivor. She was a woman reclaiming her life, her identity, and her dignity. The seeds of a new life had been sown, nurtured by compassion, courage, and the unwavering belief that even the deepest wounds could give way to growth, beauty, and hope. Time flowed differently in the estate now. The young woman, once a fragile figure at the mercy of cruel circumstances, had blossomed into a confident, self-assured presence. The freedom granted to her, coupled with her own resilience, had allowed her to rebuild not only her life but her sense of self. Every corner of the estate, the sunlit gardens, the quiet library, the stables bore witness to her transformation. As though her presence infused the space with a quiet vitality that had been absent before, her relationship with the man who had purchased her, once defined by power and ownership, had evolved into something far deeper. The trust, respect, and subtle bond they had nurtured over months had grown into mutual admiration and a profound emotional connection. He no longer saw her as a possession, nor did she see him solely as a figure of authority. Instead, they recognized each other as equals in the delicate dance of shared understanding, each acknowledging the strength, courage, and humanity of the other. Small gestures, a thoughtful glance, a shared laugh, a brief hand on the shoulder conveyed more than words ever could. She continued to heal from the traumas of her past, and the estate became a sanctuary rather than a prison. The memories of her lost child still lingered, but they no longer held her captive. Instead, they reminded her of the depth of her resilience and the capacity of her heart to endure and survive. She allowed herself to dream again, to imagine possibilities that had once seemed unattainable. She envisioned a life that included joy, connection, and perhaps one day, the chance to nurture a family on her own terms. The household staff, and even members of the surrounding community began to see the changes in her. Where once she had been invisible or pitied, she was now respected and admired. Her kindness, intelligence, and unwavering courage had left an indelible mark, inspiring those around her and creating a ripple effect of compassion within the estate. People sought her guidance, valued her insights, and most importantly, recognized her humanity. She was no longer merely surviving, she was thriving. The man who had given her this chance also experienced transformation. Witnessing her growth and resilience deepened his empathy and understanding of what it meant to truly care for another person. The quiet bond they shared blossomed into affection, a love rooted not in obligation or ownership, but in genuine connection, admiration, and shared values. They spent time together not as master and servant, but as partners in life, exploring the estate, discussing ideas, and discovering the simple joys of companionship. Though society might have still judged their relationship or questioned the circumstances of their connection, it mattered little to them. They had transcended the constraints of past injustice, finding freedom not only in circumstance but in emotional honesty and mutual respect. They had built something enduring from the rubble of tragedy, a foundation of trust, care, and hope for the future. The young woman's journey from betrayal, loss, and commodification to freedom, healing, and empowerment culminated in a life that was finally her own. The estate, once a symbol of confinement, now stood as a testament to transformation, resilience, and the power of second chances. Together, she and the man who had once been her mysterious buyer envisioned a future where compassion, choice, and love guided their lives. In the quiet evenings, as the sun set over the estate's gardens and the first stars appeared in the sky, they would stand together, hands intertwined, reflecting on how far they had come. The past remained a shadow, but it no longer defined them. Instead, it had shaped their strength, illuminated their capacity for love, and prepared them for the life they were building together. In each other, they had found hope, partnership, and the promise of a life that honored resilience, courage, and the transformative power of human kindness. The story closed not with an ending, but with a beginning, a life forged from hardship, restored through compassion, and filled with hope. It was a life that she had claimed for herself, guided by her own courage and nurtured by someone who believed in her when the world had not. The future stretched before her, unbound and full of promise, a testament to the enduring strength of the human spirit.